So this morning, I wake up to a news headline in my feed that says Sony is now going to rethink its entire superhero strategy when it comes to its movies. Now, this could just be a speculative rumor or wishful thinking, but it dovetails with all of Disney's Marvel failures the last few rounds at the box office, and how Marvel is only going to have one movie this year now as they try to scale back their entire creative strategy themselves. And I just kept wondering to myself when I saw the headline about Madame Web's box office failing, who they thought they were making that movie for. Because it took the headline of its box office failure for me to even remember that it had been made and was coming out. It takes an impressive amount of incompetence, to tell the public in today's day and age, hey, we're making a superhero movie in the Spider-Man universe that will be starring the very popular Sydney Sweeney, who is very photogenic. And we're also going to have some other female heroes in it. So the guys who love comic books should be excited because it's in the Spider-Man universe, and we've got the second Spider-Woman in it, played by Sydney Sweeney, who's one of the more popular actresses in the industry right now. And according to Hollywood's own theory, the female side of the demographic should be excited because it is a female-centric superhero film. And nobody showed up. Nobody showed up because that audience that they have in their minds at the corporate Hollywood level, that audience doesn't exist. Corporations seem to do this thing where they formulate the answer before they collect the facts. And they buy the franchises with their own objective in mind and their own destination in mind before they even know if the destination exists. So you have these companies consistently doing this across the board where they say, this property is really popular, so popular, in fact, that we want to buy it. But we don't want the audience that made it popular and is keeping it popular. We don't want them. We want this other audience that we imagine in our mind exists because we want them to exist. And this audience has nothing to do with gender lines or sexual orientation lines or anything like that. They have fooled themselves in certain corners of Hollywood into believing that that's all it takes for that audience to show up. But Hollywood has forgotten that Hollywood is a non-essential industry. And its function is supposed to be to entertain the public, all of us, not come up with these weird, lofty goals that they've set for themselves for God knows what reason. But in the doing of setting these goals, they're setting these goals based on an imaginary audience member, an imaginary consumer, who they then impose all of these narrative and creative preferences on. In other words, their tastes. They believe that there is a person out there who wants to watch this stuff that we're making with these very specific, strange, creative tastes. I said in a video years ago that it's always the most boring person in the room who defaults to politics in conversation. And that's true. It still holds true. There's a lot of people in the corporate world that don't have lives. They have a lot of money, but that doesn't mean they have lives. And they're the most boring people in the world to talk to in any conversation. I think I told you in a video one time, I think it was the Iger sanctioning video, where I said, There was a guy that showed up. He was new to our company, but he was not new to corporate America. He had decades of experience, and I went to introduce myself in his office and just making small talk. And I said, "So, what are you interested in? What are some of your, interests, hobbies, whatever, when you're not working?" And he sat back for a minute. And he thought, I don't know. I don't think I have really any interests. This guy was a lot older than me, so he'd not had interests for a really long time. And that was an honest, unironic answer. That's corporate America. And when you get people like that, it's either going to default to they're kind of boring, like this guy, or, God forbid, they jump right into their personal politics in a conversation. That's the worst. That is the worst. And that's what we're dealing with here in Hollywood right now is you have these people who get to make decisions because they're in charge with the corporate money. So they're buying these franchises that they've heard from their kids or whatever are popular. And then they're like, oh, well, but we don't want the people that we don't understand because we don't understand the property we just bought. Like whether it's Star Wars or that guy Zaslav who's inherited DC by moving in as the new CEO. His company has kind of umbrella taken over Warner Brothers, and DC is in the pits again. Let's be honest, DC never got out of the pits, but that's a story for another time, as J.J. Abrams would say. So you have these people that don't understand the properties they bought. The only thing they understand about them is that their accountants told them these things make a lot of money. So you might be able to make a lot of money with them. Oh, okay. Who's making a lot of money for these? Oh, nerds. Oh, I don't like nerds. I don't understand them. I don't like them. Can we get a new audience for that? I guarantee you that's where this all starts. Every time. You don't buy Star Wars and try and change the audience for it immediately if you understand it and if you have any respect for it. Because Star Wars, as I've said before, is the most mainstream popular brand you could have gotten. It's not anymore. And even when it was at the height of its popularity, as an example, it wasn't the majority of America. Like, the majority of America clearly went to see it, but it doesn't mean everybody walked away being a lifer, like, for Star Wars. They didn't all walk out of that movie going, I'm going to be a Star Wars fan for life. Some of them just walked out saying, good movie, and then went on with their lives. And they're like, oh yeah, that Star Wars movie I saw years ago. Yeah, that was pretty fun. What was his name? Dark Vader? You remember those people. They're nice and they mean well, but they're not like dyed-in-the-wool Uber fans. You know what I mean? They just saw it. It was a good experience. They moved on. Because again, Hollywood, non-essential industry. So they don't really like us. So they don't want us. They don't understand us. The Hollywood people. They want the franchise, they want the money, but they can't get out of their own way to make the connection that the people who kept it successful were all of us. So now let's bring this around to Madam Web. You've got Sydney Sweeney on the phone, and she's willing to play the second version of Spider-Woman, who, while not the most popular Marvel character, is known. She was part of the Avengers West Coast. She had her own comic book miniseries in the 90s. I knew about her. I collected her comic book miniseries as a Spider-Man fan. I considered her part of the family. I liked her character a lot. So for a character that nobody, including myself, ever thought would get the privilege of a movie, suddenly not only do you have a movie that you hear is going to include her, but that they finally got an actress that looks pitch perfect to play her. They didn't try to cast against type, if you know what I mean. And then, seconds later, you find out, but the movie's not called Spider-Woman. The movie's called Madam Web. Now look, I recognize that there are things that exist from before I was alive. And there are many of them, including Spider-Man himself, that have stood the test of time. But I'm going to be straight up and tell you, I wasn't immediately sure who Madam Web was. And then they said, and Madam Web is the main character of this film, and it's a character that will be played by Dakota Johnson. You got Spider-Woman in a movie. Why do you need all these other characters? You've got one of the most popular actresses right now signed on to play her. Men and women both like her. Can someone tell me what makes Dakota Johnson the bigger box office draw? Because sometimes Hollywood gets addicted to an actress or actor that nobody else really cares about. And if we're being real for a minute, Dakota Johnson is the last person I would think of for a comic book film. And also, I don't know anybody that's like making websites to devote themselves to Dakota Johnson fandom. I don't know any. She in interviews she seems like milquetoast to me. I know that sometimes Hollywood fixates on people. They've done it decade after decade. People that aren't really all that accepted by the audience at large, the moviegoers at large, and yet Hollywood keeps thinking to itself, if we just keep putting this person in more and more films, people will eventually love them. It doesn't usually work. And so you have this character that's relatively unknown with Madam Web, and then you have Dakota Johnson, who, again, and I'm going, I'm certainly not interested to see this film, especially when I find out that they've made Spider-Woman the second stringer. That was kind of a slap in the face to me. I was like, that doesn't make any sense at all. It gets back to the imaginary audience thing. And when you look at Hollywood's trend of doing this over the last few years, you see, I came from a generation and a life where Hollywood knew from movie to movie who it was aiming the movie at. And I don't mean specifically, I mean that they at large knew who this movie would appeal to. It doesn't mean that it wouldn't appeal to other people. It doesn't mean that it might not have some crossover appeal. But it means that by and large, they knew that there was an existing audience in place for the movie they were making. And they were pitching that ball into that wheat field and hoping that it would land somewhere in the middle of that field of those people so it would do well. There's nothing wrong with that. What's wrong is when you're either so obsessed with trying to make a movie for everybody, which is impossible, or in this case, you're making a movie for an audience that isn't there. You believe it because you crazy, but the audience isn't there. And it's been demonstrated that it isn't there time and time and time and time again. Ghostbusters 2016. Nobody showed up for that movie. Not to the level that anybody was hoping. The Marvels, Ant-Man Quantumania, Madam Web, need we go on? You see, back in the day, and not that long ago actually, all of this has shifted within the last 10 to 15 years. They knew who the mainstay audience was probably going to be for any movie they greenlit. They knew. With rare exception, they knew. And those rare exceptions tended to be the ones that had big conceptual problems, even bigger marketing problems, and they flopped. We've always had flops. It's going to happen. But by and large, even if the movie only did modest box office, they knew who they were going after. And they knew that those people actually existed. And then the movie had to live and die on its own merits with that audience, whether or not it was the audience loved it or rejected it. Now, that's all measured by box office. That's the great equalizer with this. And yes, there are movies that have been sabotaged at the box office, just like TV shows that kept getting rescheduled to get killed, like Firefly. But by and large, at the movie theater, the box office can even save a middling film, as far as the way it was, like if it was marketed in a middling way because the studio didn't believe in it, but it was really good, the audience picked it up at the time, like Star Wars, or they picked it up later when home video came out. So like Beastmaster, as an example. Blade Runner, as an example. These are films that didn't do well in the theater, but through home video, they've become, redeemed. But barring those exceptions, you can pretty much rely on boffo box office to tell the story of whether or not a movie found its audience. And when we're talking about finding that audience, it used to be a little more clear. It used to have a little more clarity of thought put into it. They believed that they were targeting women with Madam Web and with the Marvels and with Ghostbusters 2016. The women didn't show up. I don't think there's anything wrong at all. At all. There's no but coming. I don't think there's anything wrong at all with making movies for women. I think it's a wonderful thing. I think everybody should have the kind of movies that they want to see. And it's okay for a predominantly large number of women in our population to like period romance or like romantic comedy or like whatever it is that they like at the time. Whether it's, now they always joke that women love true crime. Great. You know what? I think that's wonderful when entertainment includes everybody's tastes. I think that's how the entertainment world survives. It has to survive on knowing what people like. But you can't start trying to tell people what they like. And that's been the prevailing theory as to what's been going on. I know that some studio heads have tried to claim this is what you should like. But barring that, I think that's their desperate Hail Mary reaction to the former, which is they imagined that this group of people existed, that there was this magically large audience of culturally generalized people that all were going to love this same thing. They're out there. They're the silent majority. They're out there. And it was all just a delusion. They weren't there. They're not there now. So you've got these films like, Ghostbusters 2016, and you've got Madam Web, and then you've got the Marvels, and you've got other films like that did not do well at the box office because the audience didn't show up. The audience that they believed existed didn't show up. And they think, well, we understand what people want. We understand what women want. No, you don't. You clearly don't. Titanic. Titanic had crossover appeal because of James Cameron, but I think we can all agree that by and large, Titanic was the most successful romance movie of all time. Period. Romance. Historically based romance. And then all these studios chased it with things like Pearl Harbor to try and recapture it, and that didn't work. The difference with Pearl Harbor and Titanic was they were like, we'll capture the men with war and we'll capture the women with the romance. Well, that didn't work because the war wasn't done all that well, and the men knew that there wasn't supposed to be diversions to romance during a war, and the women didn't want to go see all the brutal war, and they wanted to see the romance, and so nothing in Pearl Harbor worked. And so the film really didn't do all that well, comparatively speaking. But Titanic, on the other hand, you had a lot of men who were Titanic enthusiasts who knew that James Cameron was a Titanic enthusiast. So they knew all of those technical aspects were going to be correct. And then you had two of the hottest stars at the time, Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, in there for the story side of the film. And whether or not the expectation flipped, it ended up being a movie that was far more broadly embraced as a romance by the female audience, and the men were there for the boat sinking, but the men's comments were always, it's about a boat sinking and a romance happened. A romance happens in the middle of a boat sinking. And then some people joked, oh, it's a romance, and a boat sinks, kind of thing. So there were a lot of those kind of comments flying around. But it's undeniable that movie was a massive success and the audience showed up. The Notebook, period romance, audience shows up. The audience is largely women, and that's totally okay. And then the most recent example, Barbie. And look, whatever you think about Barbie, I don't really think about Barbie because I don't understand why any Gen X guy would really care about Barbie, because we certainly wouldn't have gone to that movie when we were kids. But that's a whole different situation. My point is, I don't really go looking for boogeymen in all movies these days, especially movies whatever. Whether you see boogeymen in Barbie or not, that's not the point. It doesn't matter what our personal opinions or takes on Barbie are. What matters is Barbie made $1 million. And there's no denying that Barbie, of all the films I've mentioned, could easily be said to have been one that was marketed first for a female audience. And there's nothing wrong with that. And the audience showed up because the production knew exactly who they were going after. It's why the MCU did so well pre-Endgame. They knew who their audience was then. Comic book enthusiasts who read Marvel Comics and who knew these superheroes, male or female, gay or straight. We're going to deliver on that promise. Awesome. I haven't heard anybody say that they liked the stuff that they started trying to force into those films. And it kind of started with Endgame and Captain Marvel. It's really telling, I think, that the internet has come together and they've said, yeah, Endgame had some problems like the time travel, and then the next thing they mention is that really contrived bit where suddenly like 15 female superheroes all come together in a group after a massive melee or whatever. And it does look like an afterthought. It does look like a reshoot. And Marvel fans in general thought that was a big eye roll. I was one of them. And my favorite part of the whole movie, as troubled as some of the script in Endgame is, especially with the time travel stuff and everything like that, my favorite part of the entire film involved a woman. And that was when Scarlet Witch confronts Thanos. I think it's the best moment in the whole film. And that's not me posturing or virtue signaling. That's my genuine... I'm not saying that all the other parts of the movie stink. I'm not saying that it's not awesome to see Captain America fight Thanos with Mjolnir, all that kind of stuff. I think there's a ton of great moments in the movie. But Wanda facing off against Thanos was awesome. Like, that was an incredible moment. It was one of the best MCU moments ever. It was like Luke finally screaming at Darth Vader and going after him. So my point in saying that is, female characters in these movies, that we have not run out of female characters, and we've not run out of all of these opportunities that have been expertly taken for these characters to earn their amazing moments in a way where the whole crowd is pleased, the crowd for that movie. We used to live in a world where the film industry knew who its customers were. You can't say, I don't like any of you anymore, and I'm just going to go make up my own customers over here, because then you're going to start showing movies to nobody, because those people don't exist. We're living that right now with Madam Web. You've got an industry that doesn't understand its business anymore. It literally doesn't understand its business. Someone's going to say out there, well, Michael, there are female Ghostbusters fans too. Yes, there are. They existed before the female Ghostbusters movie came out. They liked the original Ghostbusters films. I'd be very interested to find out how many of those Ghostbusters fans who happen to be female, who had an outlier of taste within their own demographic for Ghostbusters versus their at-large demographic, how they felt about that movie, and how they feel about these subsequent films that are coming out. There's nothing wrong with aiming a movie at, okay, we're going to aim this movie at, as George Lucas famously said, 12-year-old boys. There's a lot of female Star Wars fans from going back before Disney owned the property. A lot of them. George Lucas wasn't trying to exclude women from watching his films, but you have to pick a target. You have to pick somebody tangible to aim your product at first. And then the rest of it is going to come naturally. And in the case of Star Wars and the original trilogy, it came naturally because producer Gary Kurtz and the writers made sure with each installment of that trilogy to infuse it with a lot of subtext, to make it palatable, to make it compelling for the parents that were also taking the kids. In many ways, Star Wars, the original trilogy, was the first Pixar. Without, being a comedy and without being animated. It was, hey, yeah, this is suitable for children. It has the spirit and it has the whimsy for kids with the space fantasy, but we're not going to make it Teletubbies. We're going to make it something that everybody can sit down and enjoy who brings their kids into this theater, and maybe everybody will walk away from it liking it. My father and my mother, they liked Star Wars, but they weren't of my generation of kids. So they walked away from it saying, yeah, we liked them. They were fun to watch. We don't mind when our kids put them on. We don't run from the room like we do when they put on one of their weird cartoons or whatever. But they're not going to be Star Wars fans like we were. And we grew up into adulthood still loving it. And now the Star Wars franchise is fractured and they don't know who their audience is anymore. And so Star Wars has been dog paddling around for the last 6 or 7 years, not understanding what it's about. It doesn't know itself. I feel like we might finally be at a turning point. Despite Bob Iger's recent comments, despite all that, he can make all the comments he wants. If the movies keep getting smacked down by the public at large because they're not interesting and no one's going, then he can spout all he wants. It's not going to make a bit of difference. It's not going to make a damn bit of difference. Madam Web is the nadir of this level of willful ignorance. They've realized on some level, or else these news stories wouldn't be speculating on this. They have to have realized at some level that they have found themselves with their back turned on the edge of the volcano with this kind of stuff. This Madam Web crap. That's just what I'm calling it. The Madam Web crap applies to all these other movies I've discussed. There's the situation with Star Wars and everything else. It's called the imaginary audience. The audience who wasn't there. Because if the audience was there, they'd be showing up. And it's not like they've made it a secret who they think their audience is. They generalize just as much as they accuse average humans of doing that they don't like. They think that Madam Web, they think that Madam Web, because it has women in it, is going to appeal to women. Well, if that was that simple, then it should be really easy to make $1 billion at the box office. It's not that simple. And now we're at a point where Hollywood has decided for the last few years they're not going to put anything but vapid CGI-filled blockbusters in theaters. It was a Herculean effort that made the news last year that Oppenheimer and Barbie were this thing at the box office because they've been not making movies in the variety they used to for theatrical release anymore. So what are they making? They're making superhero movies that are aimed at an audience that predominantly has not been interested as a majority in the past. In other words, we have data. As a majority, they're not necessarily interested in superhero movies. And the types of films that Hollywood, by and large, is not putting in theaters anymore in the numbers they used to are romantic comedies, period dramas, historical pieces, things like that. Things that women liked to go to and, taking their boyfriends or husbands with them when it was date night. Which some of those movies actually have crossover appeal. It's not to say that the men that went to all of those films didn't like them. That's not true at all. But what they've done is they've said, the films that we traditionally would be able to rely on a female audience to support through that initial box office weekend to give it legs, we are not going to put as many of those in theaters anymore, if any. They're all just going to get dumped onto streaming like chaff. But over here, we're going to take these films that were, by and large, for teenage kids and maybe young males, And we're going to put those in theaters, but for our imaginary audience of comic book ravenous women who we have appealed to over these years, because we believe that all women have always been interested in comic book superheroes, and we are going to show them the light. We are going to show them that these movies we will play those pipes, and they will show up to the box office for these films. It is supreme arrogance. It doesn't work that way, and it is insulting to everyone. Everybody. You've slapped your male audience around by saying we tacitly admit that the stuff that you like gets good box office when it's good, but we don't understand it, so we're going to make it terrible, which is bad enough. And then we're going to say that the stuff that we made that's terrible is the slop that we're going to feed to women, which is horrendously insulting. And by the way, the movies that you did like, ladies, we don't think those are worthy of being theatrically released anymore. So hope you have, some good Netflix options for straight to DVD, garbage, because we're not going to put money into those anymore. Not in the numbers we used to. And certainly most of them aren't going to go to the box office for date night. They'll be a streaming thing. Netflix and chill. They're giving this demographic, and not just women, of course. This imaginary audience is one that they see in their mind's eye is, encompassing of all these different traits, all these different orientations and backgrounds and ethnicities and all this kind of stuff. And they think that they can throw all of us into this soup and then say, this will appeal to all of you. I think what they fail to realize fatally is that we're not looking for something that we necessarily can relate to on a literal one-to-one level. We're looking for a good story to get behind. All of us are looking for a good story. And to come out and say that, oh, well, we're finally championing all these people, but we're giving them the worst scripts because we're not really seeing them as people. We have defined and stereotyped and generalized them in our conception of this imaginary audience just as much as we've generalized and marginalized our traditional audiences that we've abandoned. Because make no mistake, they have abandoned the female audience just as much as they've abandoned the male audience. They're not giving them what they want. They're telling them what they should want while giving them inferior films that cost a lot of money, that nobody likes because the audience literally isn't there. It's baffling. And I don't know how much more financial pain and monetary hits they're going to have to take before they finally tap the mat and cry uncle and quit this. There are opportunities being wasted left and right because they have disrespected everybody. And the sad part is that some people buy into their BS and they don't realize they're being disrespected. I am always on the hunt for a good story. That is my one requirement. It doesn't matter if it's a comedy or a drama or set in Victorian England or set wherever. Dude, one of my favorite things in the world as far as cinema is watching Hong Kong martial arts cinema watching Japanese cinema, European films. And when we look at, when we're talking about specifically Hong Kong martial arts cinema and Japanese cinema, they weren't out to make those movies for me. Those movies were not aimed at me. I know that because they have subtitles, and or they had to be clumsily dubbed into English at some point. But they weren't making those movies thinking, that guy over in America who likes science fiction and old cartoons and World War II history, we're going to make sure that this movie also includes him. We're going to make sure that this movie appeals to him on some level. I'm really glad they didn't do that. I'm glad they were just focused on trying to tell a good story for the audience they were trying to capture. When it was Hong Kong action cinema, they made Hong Kong films back then, and still do, where it's male protagonists. They're probably targeting, guys with those. And then they make the ones like the Inspector Wears Skirts series and In the Line of Duty, those films, and many like them. The Legacy of Michelle Yeoh and others, where they're meant to say, yeah, and here's some more Hong Kong martial arts action and gunplay and all that, explosions and all that kind of stuff. And these are women that female audience members here in our country like and want to go see. They knew their audience. They know their audience. They try to respect their audience. I'm sure they have their flops like any other entertainment industry. But I think those movies are amazing. Not all of them. I've seen ones I don't like, but I've seen a lot of them that I do. And I know for a fact they weren't targeting me. I know for a fact they weren't about me. And I'm fine with that. Doesn't enter my mind. Shouldn't enter yours either. Find the good story. I'm okay with being an outlier. There's a lot of stuff that's aimed at women or aimed at, take your pick. Pick your letter out of the alphabet. And I've really liked them because the scripts are really good. I don't understand this whole Madam Web, Marvel's Ghostbusters 2016 business headspace. And you can apply a lot of that to the current spate of Star Wars vomit as well. It's not resonating with people, and you can measure it not resonating with people. Because if Star Wars was doing well, those movies wouldn't have stopped. And we haven't had a Star Wars movie since when? Because they were bad. And it took people a while once the hype train died down, because Star Wars usually had a healthy amount of hype-filled rocket fuel behind it when there was finally a new movie coming out. I think we can all agree that Phantom Menace wasn't exactly the perfect cinematic experience, but it had enough hype behind it to earn almost $500 million in 1999. But everybody admitted, yeah, they could pick this up a little bit at some point. I'm not going to go into my opinions on the prequels. You've heard them before. But then when the sequels came out, that episode 7 had a similar amount of hype-driven rocket fuel behind it. Doesn't mean the movie was any good. In fact, the movie was a disaster. And it spelled disaster for the rest of that trilogy. Because again, they started from the first starting line, that first step. They were assuming a different audience. Look, my favorite singer is Kylie Minogue. Not exactly defined today as somebody who appeals to, if you were to just take a glance at me, somebody like myself. But I have loved Kylie Minogue as a singer since 1990. 1990. So we're going on 34 years here, people. She's not in the genre that you would think that, at a glance, that a guy like me that would be my first choice. One of the ones recently that people couldn't believe when I threw the clips into Man-Child News, one of my favorite anime is Rascal Does Not Dream of Bunny Girl Senpai. That's not ironically. I genuinely think it's an amazing show. But I am not the type of person, when you would just glance at me, that you would think that I would like that. Now, the reason I bring this up is to say that outliers do exist. And we can recognize that there are going to be outliers that discover and find things that are not necessarily in their major lane, and they love them all the same. And that's good. We need variety in our lives. But you've also got to pick an audience so that you're designing a story to maximum effect around it. Because if you don't have a clear idea of who your audience is, or if you're aiming for an audience that you have, in your own delusion, created, then that means that that story you're designing will not be designed to maximum effect. It will not be good or effective, and therefore it will capture no one. So, for example, if you're able to make a story that's for an audience that you don't visualize as me, which is fine, but you know that audience is real, you know that audience has a history of attending these types of movies, and you make the best script you can make and you film the best movie you can film, well, guess what? You have a higher chance of getting me and many people that don't even look like me or have the same background as I do, who also aren't in your audience group, to hear it by word of mouth that this is a really good movie, regardless of what the original target audience was. And some of us are going to go check it out, and we're going to be like, wow, cool. It doesn't mean that the majority of us are always going to flock to it, you know. There are a lot of guys that they weren't ever going to get into The Notebook. I was one of them. But it's okay to, like I said, be a movie for women. It's okay. Because as long as those movies are successful because they found their audience, that's how the entertainment industry will survive. And right now it's not surviving. Right now it is, you know, borrowing from Peter to pay Paul and trying to merge here and there and selling off their disc businesses to another company because they can't hack it anymore. They're all just getting closer and closer and closer and more inbred together. Paramount's collapsing, and Warner Brothers Discovery might have turned a profit on streaming, but it's not quite making the grade overall. Is this working for you, Hollywood? Is it working? Because it seems like same shit, different day. You guys don't know which way to juke now. What does it take to form a team of people that had maximum goodwill success after Spider-Man No Way Home? Everybody was clamoring for a Tobey Maguire Spider-Man 4 and an Andrew Garfield Spider-Man 3 because that movie was so well received. And you guys turn around and say, nah, Madam Web. You would have done fine if it had been Spider-Woman with Sydney Sweeney. That would have actually been a good risk. But you guys didn't have the writers for it. You proved that. But you decided to do this weird kitchen sink approach that doesn't resemble anything. And you managed to sow disinterest and or flat out turn away everyone. Women don't care. Men don't care. Other genders clearly didn't care. They didn't show up either. The next 2 to 3 years are going to be really interesting in Tinseltown, but I just don't know if I'm here for it.